Welcome to this explainer. So today we're diving into a fascinating group of psychological rebels. These are the thinkers who looked at Sigmund Freud's famous theories, essentially thanked him for his time, and then decided, you know what, we need a massive update here. They took Freud's pretty dark, biologically driven vision of humanity, and they transformed it into a much more optimistic, forward-looking picture of who we actually are.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start by looking at that initial shift away from Freud, and then we'll explore the groundbreaking ideas of 5 distinct thinkers: Carl Jung, Karen Horney, Alfred Adler, Erich Fromm, and Erik Erikson.
All right, part 1, moving beyond Sigmund Freud.
You know, a lot of these post-Freudian thinkers actually worked right alongside Freud in the early days, but they eventually broke away because they felt he was missing a massive piece of the human puzzle. As you probably know, Freud placed this huge emphasis on the id, that tangled, unconscious reservoir of sexual and aggressive biological tendencies. But the post-Freudians, they really expanded on the concept of the ego. They argued that, hey, we aren't just prisoners of our animal drives. Instead, they chose to focus on our distinctly human qualities, things like our creativity, our competence, and our ability to actually solve problems. It's this fundamental shift, really, from a pessimistic biological determinism to a highly optimistic focus on what we can consciously achieve.
Moving into part 2, Carl Jung and analytical psychology.
Jung broke away from Freud specifically because he believed we're guided just as much by our future aims and aspirations as we are by our past. We aren't just pushed along by history, we're actually pulled forward by our goals. And this line of thinking led to his absolutely captivating idea of the collective unconscious. Jung claimed that we don't just have a personal unconscious filled with our own individual memories, instead we share this inherited reservoir of primordial images or archetypes. Think about concepts like a supreme god or a nurturing Mother Earth. These specific images mysteriously show up in the myths, the dreams, and the art of all mankind across completely disconnected cultures. Basically, his idea is that we inherit them.
So for Jung, personality isn't really about battling the demands of society. It's way more about balancing the competing forces and structures within ourselves. The self fundamentally strives for unity and oneness. And to achieve a truly healthy personality, to reach that wholeness, a person actually needs to become increasingly aware of this deep, inherited wisdom that's sitting right there in the collective unconscious and ultimately learn to live in harmony with it.
Which brings us to a pretty critical question. Do biological and inherited factors strictly dictate who we are? Or does our culture and our immediate environment play a bigger role in shaping our psychological health? Definitely keep that in mind as we transition to our next incredibly optimistic thinker.
That brings us to part 3, Karen Horney, optimism and culture.
Karen Horney was another brilliant disciple who ended up deviating from Freud. She adopted this deeply optimistic view that was fiercely centered on human growth and self-actualization. She also directly challenged Freud's treatment of women. See, where Freud leaned heavily on biology to assert female inferiority, Horney totally countered that. She argued that men and women have mutual attributes to admire, and neither sex is inherently superior. She posited that women, well, and people in general, really, are far more likely to be affected by social and cultural factors than by strict biology.
Horney believed that psychological distress wasn't really about those repressed biological urges Freud talked about. For her, it was all about disturbed interpersonal relationships, especially during childhood. Think about it. When parents are indifferent or erratic or discouraging, and let's be honest, we can probably all relate to the stress of a discouraging parent at some point, right? It creates this profound insecurity in the child. And this leads to what she called basic anxiety. If a child feels isolated and helpless because their parents are providing either way too much or way too little approval, it can generate deep resentment. She called this basic hostility toward the parents, and it heavily interferes with healthy development.
Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Have you ever felt like you just weren't quite good enough in a certain area? And as a direct result, you worked extra hard to prove that feeling wrong. Well, that very human drive is exactly the cornerstone of our next rebels theory.
Part 4, Alfred Adler and individual psychology.
Adler completely flipped the script. He assumed that all human behavior is intensely purposeful and fiercely goal-directed. Now, his most famous contribution to psychology is for sure the inferiority complex. In his view, every single individual suffers from feelings of inadequacy and guilt, which all stems from our totally helpless state in childhood. But here's the optimistic twist. Suffering from these feelings isn't some life sentence of misery. In fact, actively striving to overcome this complex is absolutely essential for optimal personality development.
So we aren't just victims of our inadequacies, they're actually our fuel.
By setting personal goals to overcome those early insecurities, we actively construct our own unique lifestyle. But Adler made a really important note here. A truly healthy lifestyle absolutely must include social interest. That means a genuine care and connection for the welfare of others. It proves that our drive to overcome our own inferiority shouldn't just be a selfish pursuit, but a socially constructive one. It gives us this immense capacity to choose and creatively build our lives, all while contributing to the wider community.
All right, part 5, Erich Fromm and the human concerns. Fromm viewed human beings fundamentally as social creatures. He believed we can only really be understood in terms of our relationships with others. He argued that our psychological growth doesn't come from satisfying base animal instincts, but rather from profound human concerns. We're talking about our deep desire for ultimate freedom and our conscious striving for justice and truth. His work beautifully recognizes the immense value of positive qualities, things like tenderness and love, in shaping our dominant character traits through our daily experiences with others.
Let me ask you another question. Have you ever experienced a true identity crisis? Like a moment where you genuinely just didn't know who you were or what your purpose was? It's a phrase we toss around all the time today, but it actually originates from our final post-Freudian thinker.
Part 6, Erik Erikson and the search for identity.
Now, unlike Freud, who basically believed your personality was totally locked in by childhood, Erikson argued that personality development is actually a rational, lifelong process centered right on the conscious ego. And this brings us to his legendary concept, the identity crisis. Erikson noted that, especially during adolescence, young people face this incredibly critical period. They have to generate a central perspective for themselves, a direction that gives them a meaningful sense of unity and purpose. The conscious ego is actively out there searching for identity amidst all the chaos of growing up.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. The journey we've taken through these 5 post-Freudian rebels shows a really clear evolution. First, they collectively rejected the idea that we're just totally determined by these dark biological urges. Second, they radically expanded the role of the conscious creative ego. And third, they showed that our personalities are deeply embedded in society. They're driven by our personal goals, and they're constantly evolving in a lifelong search for identity.
Which leaves us with this final thought. If these post-Freudian thinkers are right, if our personalities are indeed shaped by our aspirations, our culture, and our conscious, lifelong search for identity rather than just inherited biology, what are you doing today to creatively build the person you want to become? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it sparked your curiosity to keep exploring the incredible depths of psychology.